Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. This is the fourth in the New Arab webinar series. And this evening, you're joining us for Beyond Minneapolis, Black Lives Matter shines a light on global racism and police brutality from London to Jerusalem. For those who are new, the New Arab is a progressive and diverse London-based news organization covering the MENA region with a focus on democratic transition, human rights, and social and economic justice. My name is Malia Bouatia, and I will be chairing the panel this evening. We're very excited to be hosting some incredibly inspiring speakers this evening, Marcia Rigg and Lubna Khatami, who may be divided by the Atlantic, but whose struggles are very much aligned. Following the brutal murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police in May, local outrage over the death of yet another Black man at the hands of state forces grew into a global Black Lives Matter movement. Mass protests in the US have forced urgent conversations on systematic racism and police brutality to the center. These developments have also encouraged many to look at their own countries, to interrogate the repressive practices of state forces, and have empowered the organization of movements against them. In the UK, where Black people are over twice as likely to die in police custody and are more likely to be stopped and searched, growing demonstrations are demanding an end to structural racism and police violence. In the Middle East and North Africa, the question of state repression has also been at the forefront of uprisings and social movements. Protests had already been taking place across the MENA region for many months and have been met with aggressive and often fatal repression by police and military forces. And when Labour Member of Parliament Rebecca Long-Bailey was removed from her post in the shadow cabinet over claims that the killers of George Floyd had learned their tactics from Israeli secret services, who are known to use them against Palestinians in the occupied territories, this raised questions about the transnational police cooperation. If state forces are perfecting their repression through the sharing of information and training, then resistance to this should also transcend borders. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers who'll shed further light on some of these issues on a local, national, and even international level. Marcia Rigg, who is the sister of Sean Rigg, who died in police custody in 2008 following prolonged restraint by police officers in Brixton, London, is also a leading member of the United Families and Friends campaign, a coalition of those affected by the deaths in police, prison, migration, and psychiatric custody in the UK. Our other speaker is Lubna Khatami, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California in Los Angeles. Khatami is also the former executive director of the Arab Cultural and Community Center in San Francisco and a founder and former international general coordinator of the Palestinian Youth Movement. Thank you both for joining us. I think to kickstart the discussion, I want to ask you, Lubna, to perhaps give us a little insight into the current situation in the US and the impacts of the protests, especially following months of COVID-19 related lockdown.
Well, thank you, Malia, and I'm very honored to be here today and to be speaking alongside Marcia. I think your question is something that, you know, if you had asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have said that this is just really such an incredibly inspiring moment. I still feel that way, but as you've earlier of the state.
Sorry, Lubna, I think you just cut, we lost you briefly. Perhaps if you can start from the beginning. Apologies.
No worries. I'm sorry about that. So I just wanted to say that I think that this is a deeply inspiring moment here in the United States.
We seem to be losing Lubna, likely due to connection problems.
Okay, I could try to work on it if that's okay.
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 We can hear you now, Lubna. Perhaps if
Oh,
you,
okay.
yeah.
So I was just saying that I think it's a really important, incredible time here in the United States. We are experiencing mass mobilization across US cities that of course do have a spontaneous character, but that do have a very consistent message around the importance of Black life, around resisting state violence, defunding police, and investing in communities. And I think that that is something that has been felt and been worked on by organizers for decades, but it's really kind of coming to a boiling point right now. And of course, that is in no small part due to how the coronavirus pandemic, made so many people realize the failures of the state and the very racialized ways that the state privileges certain communities in life over other communities.
And how do you feel about the current state of repression? Like, what has been the response from the state? We hear of curfews being introduced, of arrests, of physical violence towards protesters.
Well, I think, on the one hand, it's always disappointing to see the arrests, the violence, but it's also expected. And this is exactly why people are rising up, right? There's been for so long this state, every time communities rise up against a police officer who has murdered an innocent person of color, specifically a Black person, the discourse always kind of stays the same, which is it was one bad cop, it's a few bad apples, it was a mistake, they thought that they were under attack. And what communities are saying out on the streets is that police are not failing to do their job. They're doing exactly what they were intended to do. They are being funded to come out here and hunt people of color, specifically Black communities. They have created an industry in which there's incredible amount of profit being made from the militarization of police in inner cities, the weapons that are being used, and the surveillance technologies that are being used. So I think when we see police officers come out into the streets and beating up protesters, arresting protesters, when we see their, new killings being resulting in out of these protests, we are not surprised. It is in fact a confirmation of the exact reason why we're out on the streets to begin with.
Absolutely. Do you feel that it's also in some ways silenced the critics that once thought that such expressions or notion like political lines were radical, dare I say even extreme, that actually the mood has shifted because people are far more alert to that the response by the state, the very violent response?
I'm sorry, Millie, you cut out, so I didn't hear you.
Apologies. I was just saying that, do you feel that this time round, particularly having gone through the wave of Black Lives Matter movements back in 2014, that critics have been silenced in terms of, the often characterization of these perspectives as being radical, even extreme, that now they're actually seeing the nature of these institutions, that this is systematic, that this is, um, this has a long-standing history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when the movement for Black Lives was created in 2014, it was also off of the heels of so many other Black liberation movements in the history in this country. It's so hard to segment at what point we can say that the movement for Black Lives really took place. But what we currently know as the movement for Black Lives, responding to the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, responding to the murder of Trayvon Martin, that movement at the time, people were arguing that it's radical, that it's, concepts of defunding police or even an abolition of police was impossible or utopic, and they were really written off. And I think that that's part of the problem, the fact that community-based organizers and have been written off for so long has resulted in the lack of systemic change in different on different levels. And so I think now it's so unavoidable because there's being a line drawn in the sand where people are being asked whether they stand with justice and freedom for all people, or whether they're going to be complicit in a system that oppresses people, that strips people of wealth, rights, dignity, freedoms, and protections in order to maintain a system of, white supremacy or white privilege. And so I think that right now there is kind of a mainstreaming of the language that the movement for Black Lives has been, trying to advance for so long. But there's also a lot of danger with that. Like, on the one hand, we see politicians taking a knee. We see the NFL and big corporations making all of these different claims about how they support Black Lives Matter or how they support justice and freedom for all people. And we see, real estate companies changing the names of the master bedroom. And all of these, Mark Lamont Hill just did a video. All of these are signs that, maybe there is a sort of social, cultural, psychological change in how we understand race and racial injustice in this country. But on the other hand, it doesn't address the fundamental issues of protection, justice, freedom, and a redistribution of wealth, land, and power for Black communities and other communities who have been exploited and stripped of their rights and dignity for so long in this country.
Thank you for that. Marcia, you've joined some of the demonstrations that have been taking place in London. At times, the UK is accused of being slightly behind on these questions. How did you feel being out amongst the thousands that took to Parliament Square? Do you feel there's been a shift in the political conversation, and that actually a lot more are conscious of the fact that this is as much a UK problem as it is a US one?
Hi, sorry. Yes, well, certainly this is a great shift globally, really, and I think initially the protests in the United Kingdom, the Black Lives Matter protests, they were protesting for George, and this is something that's happened before, where we've protested in the United Kingdom on behalf of the families and the deaths in the USA. So it's very important to raise the platform that deaths do actually happen here in the United Kingdom as well. And they have been happening for decades, similar to the way that George died, that everybody could see worldwide. And I think it's because that somebody videoed it and put it online. The fact that everybody was on lockdown and, were focused online platforms, that it just went absolutely global. But it's nothing new where somebody dies on camera. For instance, my brother died on camera. And there's many other families in the UK where families have died on camera and using the words, "I cannot breathe." I recall going to the United States and meeting actual families, where I was invited by the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Patrice Cullors, and alongside the support of Defend the Right to Protest and NUS students, which Mali was the head of at that time. And we went to the United States. There's 4 families, the families of Mark Duggan, Kingsley Burrell, and Leon Patterson, and myself. And we shared our stories with American families. Now, they hadn't even heard of Mark Duggan. They hadn't heard of the London riots. And I felt that people in America were completely oblivious as to what is actually happening outside of the United States. What was extraordinary to them was the fact that so many people were dying in the United Kingdom, and they were shocked to realize that not all police officers in the United Kingdom actually carry guns. And so they found that really alarming, that somebody could actually restrain somebody in a position like a chokehold, like, for instance, Rashman Charles, that died in 2017, I think, in the United Kingdom, where it was caught on CCTV in the shop that he was entering, where he was given a chokehold, and we actually see him die on camera. Nothing happened to those officers. And the inquest found that it was I think they found that it was an accident. But I don't think somebody being choked to death is an actual accident, or being restrained in the prone position for a certain amount of minutes, because that is something, just like we saw of the video of George Floyd. It takes, you know, a certain type of person, I think, to be on somebody's neck, or to be in that position on anywhere on their body, to restrict breathing for a certain amount of minutes is quite alarming. And you know, in the United Kingdom, the systemic failures and the patterns in all of the cases is that, and it's extraordinary, really. It's not a coincidence. It's deliberate. They're there to do their job, the system. But somebody's loved one is dying here. The fact that somebody can be restrained for 7 minutes. My brother, for instance, Sean Rigg, for 7 minutes, and after 11 years of a legal challenge, a fair legal challenge that I gave them, you know, I fought them fair and square. The end result was that it was not excessive. So somebody can be restrained for a certain amount of minutes and die, and that is not deemed to be excessive. How can that be? It's extraordinary. And so the families in America were really alarmed and shocked by this, that in the United Kingdom deaths like this have been happening for decades.
Absolutely. And how important do you feel that exchange was, in terms, like, from sharing the stories to even, you know, developing practices of resistance, looking at, I remember that you had even met with the American Civil Liberties Union, who were demonstrating some of the apps that they use around policing the police, that you connected with families that had like led a huge mobilization in Washington. How important do you feel that transnational exchange and solidarity was, and do you feel that it's still relevant today and it's something that we have to maintain?
Yes, it was absolutely vital that we shared stories with other families. It's not uncommon for families to feel isolated. You know, that's one of the things that happens in a legal case, where the families are told that they should not discuss the case with anybody, and that it would jeopardize the case. But in reality, what that does is it jeopardizes their case. That was my experience in terms of my own case, and listening to other families. The fact that this is a global issue, it is important that families meet globally and speak globally, because what we learn is that the systemic patterns are almost identical. The fact that when George Floyd died, the initial report was that, the autopsy report was that he died of underlying issues, some medical issue that he may have had. This is something that happens here, and if the family don't get a private autopsy, which is usually in stark contrast, you know, because they try to say that the restraint had nothing. They try to say that the restraint had nothing to do with the death necessarily. If they can use that argument, they absolutely would. And so the similarities in all of the cases were extraordinary. And so it is vital meeting other families, and deciding, you know, how can we make a real difference globally? How can we bring a public outcry? Because the public's interest carries a hell of a lot of weight in cases like these, where it serves as a purpose to put pressure, added pressure on the government to really do something constructive and make real change. So far that hasn't happened. We have so many deaths that have, you know, that's on camera with compelling evidence for all to see. And yet not one single officer in the United Kingdom has ever been convicted of a death in custody. Why is that? That in itself does not balance. You know, if you've got over 2,000 deaths and 0 convictions, how can that in itself balance out? So it is vital to meet other families, like there was the family of what was the Uncle Bobby and
Oscar Grant.
Oscar Grant, and they have a coalition of families as well. You know, we have the United Families and Friends campaign in the United Kingdom, which is a coalition of families, not just black families, but also white families, because they do it to poor working class families too. So this affects everybody, really. And meeting the other families, they thought it was really important that families were actually coming together, sharing their experiences, realizing that their case was not isolated, and realizing that, you know, that the system is corrupt. The fact that in America families receive compensation in the tune of millions, in stark contrast, UK families do not receive that. In fact, what happens is that they don't get automatic legal funding, whereas agents of the state get unlimited public funding from the public purse that could cost millions, and even billions, which is a battlefield which is unbalanced because we don't have the funding for it, and families are severely and heavily means tested in order to find out how their loved one, to get legal representation at an inquest. An inquisition in the United Kingdom, we have what's called an inquest, which is not a judicial, it's not a criminal jurisdiction, it's just a fact-finding court to find out who died, where, how, and when. But there's nothing criminal attributed to it. Now, in the past, we've had unlawful killing verdicts. I think there's been 10 or 11 unlawful killing verdicts in the United Kingdom, which means that there was some criminality found. And that should propel there to be an automatic prosecution of that officer. More recently, and certainly when my brother died 12 years ago, it's more used in the narrative verdict. So a narrative verdict is not to the same criminal standard as an unlawful killing verdict. And it can highlight all the neglects and any criminality, any misconduct, but the wording has to be careful. They cannot use wording that brings any criminality to any of the officers, even though a jury might see that. So they may come back with saying, like in my brother's death, that the actions of the officers or the inactions more than minimally contributed to their death. But effectively, it doesn't make any difference. You know, if a jury, ordinary members of the public can see that, and I believe in my brother's case, if they were given the option by the coroner for an unlawful killing verdict, that's what it would have been.
I think that you've highlighted that the question of justice that is undoubtedly bound in the resistance to these institutions and this form of state violence is incredibly long and arduous, and at times, you know, some of us forget that the long-term battles and traumas that are carried by families, and disproportionately by Black families, you know, across both countries and many others. And I think that I remember in 2014, when the masses were taken to the streets, that it was made clear that this was not a moment, that this was a movement. And I think that was so crucial in highlighting that, in making clear, in declaring that this struggle is a lengthy one, that by no means started then, nor would necessarily end with that particular uprising. And I guess a question to you both, and I'll perhaps start with Lubna. is how are we able to sustain the momentum of this period? How are those who are mobilizing, how can that solidarity and support be continued? Because Lubna, as you highlighted very well, people have been doing this for decades, arguably hundreds of years. This resistance is nothing new, and certainly not for Black communities around the world. And so I'd be interested to hear your views on this.
Yeah, thank you for that really important question, and thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that's really important, as you said, that in 2014, when the movement for Black Lives was really being inaugurated, and they called it a movement and not a moment, that was because so much patience had run dry, right? So it was, over 50 years past the civil rights passage of 65, over a term into the first presidency of a Black president in the United States. And yet we had the largest waves of Black people getting imprisoned in the United States, and really incredible amounts of violence against people of color, whether it's within US cities, in US schools, or at the borders. And so I think that one of the things when we talk about how can we keep this moment sustainable, unfortunately, one of the things that makes it sustainable is that it's necessary, right? So that the violence is continuing, the violence is not letting up. The survival of people is dependent on this movement. It is not an extracurricular activity. It is about life and death. And I think that one of the things that is really important in this particular moment is that it did take almost 10 years of these mobilizations to get to a moment where we could say it's not about one cop, it's not about one incident. The reason why the murder of George Floyd struck such a nerve, struck such a chord in this country, is because it resonated with people, that it felt familiar to people, that we had seen this before, that we had seen the suffocation and the murder of Eric Garner, that we had seen like this kind of brutality, this kind of vigilant killing, unapologetic killing happen in other places and other periods where we made noise, where we had a response, and yet still we're not seeing systemic change in, being implemented in any way. And so I think that what's really important in this particular moment is that people are saying it's not just about the cops. It's about how we understand the state in this country. It is about renaming, boulevards and avenues that are named after people who committed genocide against Indigenous people. It's about renaming monumental sites and schools after people who had held some of the largest settlement slave plantations. So I think that these are there's a reworking of how we understand the history of this country, that we need to, a real movement that's saying we need to stop glorifying white supremacists, glorifying settlers who have so much blood on their hands, and start having a more comprehensive, nuanced, and honest appraisal of history and how it's led to this current moment. One of those things in a really practical way is thinking about how we went from racial chattel slavery to the Jim and Jane Crow segregation era to the civil rights moment of the 60s, Black Power and civil rights movement.
I think we've lost you, Lubna. I think whilst we wait for Lubna to reconnect.
Is it better now?
There you are. Yes.
Okay.
Every time I remember to send the question.
I'm really sorry about the connection problem. I'm not sure what's happening, but yeah. I just wanted to wrap up by saying I think that one of the things that's really important in this appraisal that we're having in this current moment to help us make this movement sustainable is to really understand what happened after the civil rights era and the Black Power era of the 60s. That is really making people revisit how in the very moment that Black America was supposed to have attained their freedom in the 1960s, their efforts were sabotaged in a very co-opted neoliberal way where, okay, we're going to end formal du jour segregation, but we are going to rapidly expand the growth of the prison system. And we are going to rapidly grow policing in inner cities. And we are going to do this alongside creating new legislation that criminalizes things that were formerly not considered criminalized. And that is the way that Black communities and other communities of color and Indigenous communities ended up being subjects of increased state violence in the very moment that all of these formal official laws of racial oppression were supposed to have been banished from our history. So us having that appraisal in that moment is allowing us to see more clearly when we're being duped by the state, when we're being, when politicians are paying lip service to us, talking about equality and diversity and equity, but not really willing to hold police accountable, not really willing to invest in community services and mental health programs instead of investing in increased policing. And I think that's really important about this moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, thinking of the UK context, often we hear inquiry and then another inquiry and then another inquiry. And I know Marcia and the UFFC are probably so incredibly sick and tired of hearing yet another investigation is going to take place when so much evidence is already there. And Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, had proposed and had commissioned an inquiry into deaths in custody, and perhaps Marcia could speak a little more about this, whilst at the same time amplifying policies like the hostile environment, where the Windrush, which the Windrush scandal highlighted perfectly in terms of its targeting of migrants, of Black communities over such a lengthy period of time. And so the total contradiction in that and the irony was quite frankly unbearable. What were your thoughts around this, Marcia, and how, what do you envisage is also going to be a response from the UK in its current state, as we're seeing institutions and political figures kneeling on social media, even using the hashtag of Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, I find that quite hypocritical, actually, because I know the British government, like for instance, Boris Johnson, has made comment about the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, that he supports it in the United States. There's also Keir Starmer, his opposition, who has recently said that this is just a moment, that Black Lives Matter is just a moment. It's quite extraordinary, actually, because both of them are aware that there are dead bodies buried in the United Kingdom and they died at the hands of the state. And they don't seem to be acknowledging the fact that the deaths are happening here publicly, but they are aware of them. So that's why it's important that we have discussions like this, and families share their stories in order to put the pressure on the government to first of all acknowledge that the deaths happen here. We've had reviews, like the Angelina review, which was the first report, I believe, from the Home Office on the issues of deaths in custody, and there was an inquiry following a meeting that myself and the mother of Shani Lewis, where there was a summit in Westminster, which we gate crashed. And they were talking about this very, very issue. And of course, we put questions to the panel, which was the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, and who then became the Prime Minister, and other MPs. And we argued. We were the only family that were actually in that room. It was full of police and mental health nurses and other stakeholders talking about families like mine, but no family was invited. And so by doing that act of basically gate crashing it, afforded us an invitation from Theresa May to her office, where we came along with the Charity Inquest, which is an independent charity that works with families whose loved ones have died at the hands of the state, and help them through the inquest process, the inquisition process, the coroner's process, and some other families. And we shared our stories with Theresa May. And one of the things I remember saying to her, because once your loved one dies in state custody, the body is seized by the state. The body belongs to the state. And for a family to see their loved one, to identify their body, is it them that are actually dead, is difficult, because the body belongs to the state. They will conduct an autopsy, and the majority of families have actually received this. And I said to Theresa May, Theresa, could you imagine your loved one dies because we all experience death in our families, and the fact that you can't see the body and you're being told that the body belongs to the state, and you just want to hug them, you want to kiss them, you need to, it's the start of the grieving process. And she acknowledged that was important. The fact that families are given decomposed bodies for burial. My brother, it was after 7 weeks, we was given back his body, and he was, decomposed, that he had to have a special bodysuit on because his body fluids would have seeped into his clothing and his casket. These are the stories, these are the emotional sides that the families experience that need to be told. When we've just gone through, we're going through a pandemic. Even the pandemic couldn't hold back protesters going out on the street. The way that this issue is so important and affects all of us. In COVID-19 deaths, the disproportionality of Black deaths, the fact that they couldn't breathe, the way that they've explained what it feels like if you have COVID-19, and the fact that they feel that they're dying and that they cannot breathe. This is something that deaths in custody families have been experiencing for decades. The fact that we are not given, the fact of the COVID-19 deaths, that the families could not be with their loved ones, that they were buried alone with only a few people. You can't see that person. You don't know who's inside the casket. You don't know what clothing they're wearing. You don't know if body parts have been removed, because that also happens in the United Kingdom. And it just exacerbated the whole issue when George died. And I know personally that families were also being affected by COVID-19 deaths within their families. And so the mental health issues, the constant blow that families are always being given from death after death after death, with absolutely compelling evidence. There's reviews and recommendations, lessons will be learned. What lessons need to be learned for such basic things, that if you are on somebody's neck for 8 minutes at least, that person could die? It's the mindset of the officers, the fact that everybody watched that CCTV and saw that officer felt that he could actually do that without a care, without any accountability. The fact that they can act with impunity. How can that be?
Yeah.
Our basic human right to life is not afforded by the very people that are there to serve the people. And so we can talk about, changing names, street names, and, protesting and all of that. We've been doing it for decades, hundreds of years. There were deaths in custody hundreds of years when we were enslaved and chained and put in ships and carried across the Atlantic. There were deaths in custody. Nothing has changed. What we need is a real, genuine political, moral will by the government to make effective change. Otherwise, it will never change. And so far, they have shown that they're not prepared to do that. They're prepared to spend millions and billions of pounds of the public purse to get these officers off. How can that be? The Windrush generation, the United Kingdom, my generation, my parents' generation that came to this country, that built this country, you know, that served this country and worked hard in this country after the war. And the fact that they were sending us back, the very children that have been here, worked and paid their taxes, done their schooling here, and were treated as immigrants, yet an English person that emigrates to another country is not called an immigrant, they're just called an expat. Why? Are they less human than us?
According to the state, yes, apparently. The
dehumanization
of Black lives and the exploitation of Black people it seeps into every aspect of our society. And I think, like you said, that it is only through mass pressure from below in which people take into their own hands what the solutions are going to look like and what meeting demands and actually receiving justice and freedom is, and it can only be shaped by the people from below. I think just to draw on some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. So slightly going back to the international perspective, somebody has asked, how vital do you deem internationalism to be, especially considering that we've seen the revival of quotes from Black Panthers, some of their methods around addressing police violence, other civil rights figures, the importance of that history and the process of highlighting solidarity, whether it was with Palestine or those seeking the liberation, seeking liberation from their colonizers, has all somewhat resurfaced in the conversation today, particularly since the uprisings in May. I wonder if you could draw on some of that, Lubna.
Sure. Thank you for such a great question. I think I believe internationalism is incredibly vital. I think there's been so much in the United States among, for example, Arab communities, the community that I'm a part of, and Black communities, a lot of discussion about our relationship to one another and our orientation toward one another's causes. You know, in the Palestinian community, the Palestinian youth movement, the group that I've worked with for so long, we have an unwavering commitment to joint struggle with all oppressed people, wherever they are in the world. And, you know, that's not a transactional or conditional form of solidarity. That is an extension of solidarity because we see the pain and suffering and grief that other communities are going through our experience as Palestinians, as people who have lost our land to a settler colonial project, who have been pushed out of our land, for our brothers and sisters who have remained in our homeland, who are remaining under a brutal military occupation that destroys land as well as life on the regular. So I think that shared experience oftentimes does condition our solidarity with other causes and communities, but there's also a very practical examination of the systems of power that are oppressing us, whether in Palestine or the US or the UK or in South Africa. These are
Sorry, Lubna, we've lost you slightly. Lubna?
is this?
Oh,
we're back. Okay. I'm not sure where it cut off, but
systems of power.
Yes. So these are, you know, whether it's in the US or South Africa or the UK or Palestine, these are governments that are backed by corporations, backed with people with money that have deeply intimate bonds and friendships with one another across generations, across decades. They have shared tools with each other on
think we've lost you again. Our solidarity across the Atlantic may be strong, but it seems our internet connection, not so much. Maybe I'll go over to Marcia briefly around this question of internationalism, especially if we remember around the Ferguson protests, people would chant from Ferguson to Palestine, occupation is a crime. We also saw, I know that UFFC is an incredibly diverse coalition of families, and that you have worked alongside many groups seeking justice in many different forms. And I wonder, particularly drawing on like past struggles, many of us come from nations that were colonized by Europe, what your thoughts on that are?
Yeah, what a controversy. I mean, it's still so painful for us that we're still enslaved, basically. Modern day lynching, certainly in the United Kingdom, the slave masters received compensation, which was for the loss of earnings from the slaves. And that compensation wasn't finished and paid until 2015, where people in Downing Street now and in Parliament now were receiving those funds from the very people, that they enslaved from, in taxpaying money. They received that. But what did they put in its place when they say slavery was abolished? It's because we had the prison system, we had the police system, so we were still chained, we were still on the plantations, in prisons and so forth. And this is global. This is in Europe. I mean, I've met families. The name escapes me, but there's a case in Germany where they claim that this young brother burnt himself to death in his cell, but he was chained. He'd been bounded down, his legs and his feet in his cell. How could he have got a lighter to burn himself? And that family has not received justice. The fact that the similarities internationally and globally are so similar, it's really important that we have an international campaign. Absolutely. To put for pressure on governments, just like we did when it was, the slavery times, when the slaves had to fight for their struggles for freedom. We're still enslaved now, and it's important that we do it internationally, because it affects, the poor working class. It affects the most vulnerable mental health.
Absolutely.
It really affects us all, and so it is boiling point. It's a matter of urgency that we do this for our future generations. Our future generations, the current generation, the younger generation, are really awake and learning about their history, both black and white, from both sides. This is all really important lessons and education, because it's always been hidden. It's always been hidden, but now that it's coming out, there really needs to be more pressure. We cannot give up. If our ancestors had given up for the abolition of slavery, where would we be now? So we cannot I can't find the word. We cannot insult our previous activists and civil rights activists, and we cannot insult them by giving up.
Yeah.
We have to keep going until we break the change. And, you know, maybe they're thinking, you know, the powers that be are thinking, well, how can we, you know, change the system? It'd be interesting to see in terms of making them think that we've given them what they want, and then put something else in its place, just like they have done now. But how can you do that? It's changing the minds of our future generations, who will be the politicians, who will be the people that make change, and we really have to work on them. Because even though if one police officer goes to prison anywhere in Europe, or, you know, it's happened in the States, it's never happened here. It's not changed anything. It's not changed anything at all. So the system is working perfectly well as to how it was set up. Yeah. And it's completely immoral and unfair. Absolutely. And people just have to be strong to speak up, and we connect together. And when they see people connected, you know,
that's when they run scared.
That's when they may do something. You know, it takes a human story to change a human heart, and that's what we need to do today and always.
I see that Lubna's back again. Perhaps we can pick up on the question of internationalism again, Lubna. Well, you cut off. I quoted the chants from 2014 when many would shout from Ferguson to Palestine, occupation is a crime. We saw the sharing of tactics from Palestine to US protesters about how to deal with tear gas, how to effectively resist around some of the practices and tactics. And do you see that to be the essence of internationalism today?
Certainly. I mean, that was one of the things I was trying to allude to, that these systems, these states, these actors of power and oppression, they have deep, intimate bonds and relationships with one another. So the weapons that are being used in the streets of Ferguson, it's not unlikely that the weapons that were being used in the streets of Ferguson were also, you know, the same tear gas canisters that were being used in the Gaza Strip. But I think to go even deeper than that, aside from we have shared grief and we have, you know, our oppressors are friends with each other, I think that there's something a little bit more nuanced. We have to be a little bit more nuanced about how we understand internationalism. Internationalism is about this extended solidarity, working together in a joint struggle, even if we have distinct experiences and even if we have distinct struggles. So I think a lot of times people maybe are a little bit nervous of us talking about the global moment, right? The, you know, police killings across the world, military killings in Palestine, for example, because there's this, you know, feeling of, but so much of this violence is sourced in the history of anti-Black state violence, in enslavement and in segregation and in police violence against Black communities specifically. And I think that that's very important. But I also think in the recent couple decades, it's very important to see how those histories of violence were learned by actors that were then reused on other communities and geographies in the world, and then pushed back out to give new technologies and new instructions on increased killings. And I think Palestine is a really great example of that. I think in the aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 moment, the expansion of the war on terror, Israel really became a forerunner in this so-called war on terror. And that meant developing new weapons and surveillance technologies and crowd control techniques on Palestinian bodies and outsourcing it to the rest of the world. If between 2004 and
Lubna, I think we've lost you again. Are you back?
Is it better?
Yes.
Okay. So as I was saying, the Israeli economy has increasingly grown dependent on international arms trade because it is a forerunner in this kind of state violence industry. And so I think being able to see that we are against racist state violence in our domestic context, but also against empire and militarism and imperialism and occupation. Like, we cannot be against police killings, but be okay with militaries invading Iraq and Afghanistan and slaughtering people across the world. That is unprincipled, it's unethical, and it will never realize the freedom that we need. And simultaneously, we can't be against militarism and occupation, but be okay with racist state violence against a different community in the host states that we live in. I think it's so important to have reciprocal levels of solidarity with all communities, because it's the only way we're collectively going to get free.
It's also that the actually coalition building on these questions is as vital for our own movements that impact us personally or within our particular communities, as it is a show of strength and an extension of and recognition that actually your struggle is important, and therefore I want and need to put time in this. I think that those links, and as I think that often we come across issues around resourcing, even media attention, the way that the state knows how to pit movements and organizations against one another by effectively making them scramble for small crumbs. And it becomes a thing of, well, this particular issue is being highlighted far more than my particular issue, and therefore I cannot be connected to it or address it in any way, shape or form. And I think that, again, these are actually tactics that have been utilized through powerful institutions for a very long time to ensure the division of struggles, and even and to blind people into not realizing that actually the methods of repression are just being churned out against each one of those dissenting peoples, particularly. And so on that note, I wondered whether you had any thoughts on what internationalism could look like in light of this movement today. Which point should we be stressing? You mentioned the war on terror, which is often kind of misunderstood to be a specifically Muslim issue or something that impacts the Arab world, when in reality, particularly if we look at the UK, the process of racialization, that the particular violence that is meted out impacts many communities of color, migrants, despite it obviously being trialed on the exceptional Muslims, if you will.
Yes, so I think the war on terror is one thing that we need to be accounting for in terms of the type of internationalism we need to be building in the contemporary context, but there's a lot more. I mean, I think one thing that's really important is to think about what is a people's internationalism that doesn't count on any nation state as our vanguard. We are not in the 1960s where we are split in a Cold War context. We cannot expect money to be rolling in from an Eastern Bloc that has this project of anti-capital. I mean, it doesn't exist anymore. And so I think some of these states that are proposing themselves to be the anti-imperialist vanguard, they are deeply authoritarian, violent, oppressive, and not anti-capitalist. So I think the first thing we need to do when we think of the internationalism of our time is to think of a people-to-people solidarity, the people most affected by state violence, by global dispossession. I mean, we have 71 million people displaced worldwide as of 2019. That is the highest number in world history. So we have to think about the people affected by border expansion, police expansion, prison expansion, war and militarism, by climate crisis, and by all of these different catastrophes that are enveloping the world. And so by us thinking in a people-to-people fashion and really trying to figure out how we think of, this moment as an opportunity for a drastic overhaul of how we understand the systems that govern the world, right? How we understand property, how we understand wealth, how we understand nation state borders, nation state systems. I think the crisis that we're enduring right now across the world is telling us that our current system doesn't work. And it's giving us an opportunity to envision the otherwise possible worlds that we could live in. But if we trap ourselves at very minor reforms, or trap ourselves at thinking that we could, address all of these things with paying lip service without real change, we're just going to be in this until it's no longer sustainable. So that's one of the things that I would say about the way that the internationalism of our moment has to look different from past generations. We need to be building out this vision as we're building out new types of structures for carrying out organizing work.
Absolutely. And on that powerful note,
sorry, Malia, can I just say one thing real quick?
Yes, of course.
I just wanted to say, Marcia, the role of Marcia and the role of so many other family advocates is so key in this. And I wanted to just say that just a few weeks ago, we held this webinar forum with Uncle Bobby, the uncle of Oscar Grant, who was killed on the BART police, by the Bay Area Rapid Transit Police in 2009 on New Year's Day. And he gave such incredible advice to the family of Iyad Halak, the Palestinian man, the 32-year-old man in Palestine who was recently murdered just a few days after the murder of George Floyd by the Israeli police. And some of that advice was about grief and coping, but also about how to channel that grief and coping into advocacy. And I think that we really need to be, this internationalism needs to be taking lead from the family advocates who are such strong proponents of the ethics and principles that we want to advance.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I was going to ask whether there were certain rallying calls that you both wanted to issue, whether it's, locally, nationally to your own countries, but also to the international audiences that have tuned in during this webinar. Marcia.
I think this is a really, really important conversation, and I think it will be absolutely brilliant if we could have another webinar like this with the families internationally. That would be very powerful, and the advice and strategies that families can give is second to none to another family member. So I think that's one thing. Secondly, I would like to tell you about the United Families and Friends campaign. So for 20 years, we gather at Trafalgar Square on the last Saturday of every October. So this year is going to be the 31st of October, where families gather and they come with their banners and they tell their stories. It's a memorial in remembrance of our loved ones. It's not just an ordinary protest march. It's not actually a protest march, it's a memorial procession. And we walk peacefully to Downing Street outside, and we tell our stories, and people actually hear from the actual families. I think something like this internationally would be phenomenal as well. If we had a global day where all our loved ones are remembered. I think that would be really powerful. And what I've seen on the streets recently for the Black Lives Matter protests, this is exactly the type of people that we need to see on the streets peacefully in remembrance of our loved ones, to come out in the United Kingdom, not just for the American deaths, but the UK is so not innocent, and to bring to lock down the streets, nationally, if we could do that, make it the biggest in history, because the ultimate insult that people get is a death, a murder, or killing of somebody's loved one. It's the ultimate insult that we get on top of all the other issues that we all received. And this would bring a public outcry, and maybe can swing the hearts of the powers that be where legally they have no choice but to do something about it, because right now they just seem to be complacent. And certainly in the UK, they seem to be ignoring the fact that the deaths have been happening here in the United Kingdom. And so to raise that, we need to do that. There's also the film Injustice by Ken Farrow that supports, who's one of the co-founders of the United Families and Friends campaign. He made a film called Injustice back in the 90s, and it's the stories of some of the UK families where there were chokeholds and
especially Black women as well.
Yeah, and Black women as well. Yeah, and that film was banned from TV in the United Kingdom. So we currently have a petition for Channel 4 to show that film on British TV. And there is a petition. I've sent the link, so I don't know how you'll be able to get the links out for everybody to sign this. You can actually watch the film Injustice online. It's on Vimeo by Migrant Media, and there are a number of films. We have the death of Joy Gardner, who in the 90s was a Black woman who had overstayed her time in the UK, but she was a British citizen. She's one of the Windrush generation. Her mother was the Windrush generation, where there was 13 feet of tape that was taped around her face in front of her 5-year-old child. And they've received, there's no justice, you know. So there's these films, Who Polices the Police, Popo, Burn, Injustice, and Justice Denied. And these are really important, that people should watch these and listen to the voices of the families. It will make a difference. And so we want that to be shown on British TV.
Thank you, Martin.
And there's also a crowdfunder, because we now have Injustice 2. And so that it will be incredibly powerful.
Great. And finally, Lubna, before we wrap up.
Yeah, so I just have two comments. The first, of course, as many people know, Palestine is facing an extremely difficult time right now with the Trump administration rolling out the deal of the century, and Israel preparing for continued annexation of the West Bank. So, of course, applying as much international pressure as possible, standing with Palestinian communities wherever they are in the world to mobilize against continued annexation and for the end to the occupation of our homeland and for the right of all refugees to return, especially as the situation is becoming more dire. Of course, the main call that people have out right now is for all communities to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel and companies profiting from the occupation in Palestine. The second thing that I would like to say about the United States, and I know that this is especially true for just general communities, even here in the US, people of color even, you know, there's this big fear around questions of defunding or abolishing police. And I think that part of that is because it's been so ingrained in us that crime, like there's this panic around crime being a natural component of the world. And we have a lot of racialized assumptions about how crime takes place. And in addition, we have a limited imagination about what could exist beyond the police. But there were periods of time and there are places in the world that have had healthy, thriving societies without the police presence that we have here. And in fact, it was in 1968, the very year of, you know, political insurgency in this country, that a centralized police line was created to begin with to help contain that kind of political insurgency. So there's so many projects happening across the United States that provide real alternatives to policing, including how to do medical emergency response without having to call police, especially because we don't feel safe and protected by police. So, you know, before jumping to conclusions about a police-free world not being a possibility, do the research, talk to people, look at these initiatives, and maybe it'll change your mind.
Hopefully. Thank you so much. Thank you to both of our speakers and to you all for joining us. Yes, so that's the end of our fourth webinar. Please do check out the New Arab social media platforms for more information on future webinars. And thanks again to the powerful voices that joined us this evening.
Thank you.